Hello everyone, I just finished reading this book, After the Prophet, the epic story of the Shia Sunni split. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, within amongst Muslims within Islam, there are two main branches, Sunni and Shia, and they tend to be concentrated in different parts of the world geographically. But this is actually a book that was sent to me, not one I selected. It's absolutely amazing. I mean, it's 209 pages, 30 pages, 200 and something pages long. And I started reading it yesterday. I have not been able to put it down. So, the epic story of the Shia Sunni split. It's by somebody called Lesley Hazleton, who I'd never heard of either. Now, first of all, it may sound like, and it is, a book about religious history. Topic matter, oh my god, that sounds boring, right? The way it's written is absolutely incredible. It reads like a super, it reads like Shakespeare, because the true story which is told in this book, it is like Shakespeare. It's a tragedy. It has so many twists and turns, and I mean, the repercussions are still being felt now, centuries later, 1400 years later. And it's so well written, it's so brilliant. I mean, there's things in here which I never knew. Now, this is so well written, right, that my parents and I've always been raised as a Sunni Muslim. And I'm sure at some point in my life I must have been told, oh, all these Shia are, they're sinners, they're mad, they're this, they're that. But actually reading the history, if this history can be relied on, historically, it seems like the Sunni who are the manipulating, the power hungry, those who will gladly politicize religion for their gain. That's what it seems like from this book. I'm not looking for having a fatwa placed on my head or anything like that. The difference is this, okay? When the Prophet Muhammad died, he had never actually formally chosen a successor. And his death was almost too incredible to believe. Nobody thought he could die. He was only human, as he professed again and again. But when he died, the whole of the Arabian Peninsula was just in shock, mourning, shock. He basically managed to unite most of Arabia. He'd stopped the wars. He'd improved living standards for just about everybody. He'd brought peace where there was chaos, basically. So when he actually died, it was, everybody was in shock. Now, he lay dying for about 10 days. It's assumed it was bacterial meningitis that killed him, quite common at the time. And also, this was a guy who had been in many battles, in many wars. He was strong, he was of good physical stature and everything. But eventually, in his 60s, he was killed off by disease, possibly caught through wounds in a battlefield or something, but a common illness at the time. Now, obviously, this guy, the Prophet Muhammad, was the head of a religious empire. He was looked upon as the leader. Whoever inherited his power or his standing in the community had enormous power. There was his first cousin, a guy called Ali, who was much younger than he was, who at the age of 13 was the first person other than the Prophet Muhammad's wife, Khadija, his first wife, Khadija, who was about 20 years older than him. It was a monogamous relationship. After she died, Muhammad took several other wives, as everybody seems to know, mainly through, the derision that gets in the Western media. Never mind the fact that apparently, historically, according to theologians, when Joseph heard of Mary looking for a husband, he was already, apparently, according to theological history, approaching his 90s. All right, but he's never called a paedophile. Western media, there you go. So, and of course, on all the Christmas cards, he's a young man, just like Mary was, a young woman. But after Khadija died, the first person to accept Islam was Ali. Now, Ali was bloodline. He was Muhammad's first cousin as well. So a lot of people assumed that Muhammad had chosen Ali as the person to lead the Muslims after him, the first caliph. Okay, Ali did not rule for 25 years. It's such a fascinating story. I mean, in the tent while he lay dying, not in the tent, as the Prophet Muhammad lay dying, he called for a scribe because he was illiterate, and everybody assumed he was about to put in writing formally, who should inherit the kingdom of Islam, let's call it, who should lead the Muslims. But people started, everybody there was vying to be in power. But it's fascinating when you read it. Essentially, no scribe ever came. And then Abu Bakr, who was one of Muhammad's closest allies, said, look, we have the word of God in the Quran, and that is all we need. So be it. After the Prophet died, there was a long meeting. I think it's called a Shuram. I mean, I read this whole thing in 24 hours, basically, in between doing other things. And for 3 days, they went back and forth, arguing this and that, trying to reach consensus. And it wasn't Ali, the nephew, who Muhammad had said many times, he's my closest. If you follow him, you follow me, you follow God. So many examples where it seemed like Ali should have been the first leader after Muhammad of the Muslims. He wasn't a leader until 25 years later. And in that time, religion became politicized. It seemed to be Aisha, in fact, the youngest wife of the Prophet Muhammad, who by Sunnis is held up as a saint, almost like the Virgin Mary by Christians, who's also referred by Muslims, by the way. She was quite headstrong, it seemed. I mean, she drove into battle against Ali's troops. Ali was was somehow related to her. But essentially, he was the first cousin of her husband, but she drove troops against him. And it got to the point where she was an extraordinary woman, no doubt. She drove atop a camel at the front of her troops to lead war. And that battle lasted for 3 days. And then after that battle, Ali's troops kept going over to Aisha's troops to surrender, but every time one came over, she had them slaughtered. 70 people were killed like that. Quite bloodthirsty, quite ruthless. And then before that battle actually started, nobody wanted to attack Ali because Ali was the first cousin of the Prophet. Ali didn't want to attack anybody because he thought, like the Prophet, all Muslims should stand united. It was about unity. But then there was a guy called Muayiva, who was a Sunni. He was just, as far as I could tell, scheming son of a nasty piece of work. Lots of deaths, lots of killings, lots of assassinations seemed to happen at his hand. Very smart, very, very smart politically, but a real schemer. It's thought that battle, the battle between Aisha's troops and Ali's troops to see who should, take over the Muslim kingdom, Ali actually walked out from his troops and met some of Aisha's generals, and then they sat together in tents for 3 days and agreed to just disagree. They said there isn't going to be a war. And then possibly and probably through the scheming of Muayiva, a small battle broke out. Swords were drawn, they were screaming, and then everything went to chaos. The battle commenced. Thousands of people were killed. Apparently leaving that scene, both Aisha and Ali were saying to themselves, oh, that I had died decades ago and this day never happened. So they both regretted it. But then what happens that's just a part of the story. What happens after that? Oh my goodness, it's if I didn't know that if I knew nothing, if I was coming from as an outsider and I read this book and I had to say, would I, if I had to be a Muslim, go with the Sunnis or the Shias? For the first 500-600 years, I certainly would have gone with the Shias. That's probably a lot of hatred is going to come from that. Read the book, make up your own mind. And then, of course, these divides can be politicized. And they have been by the Americans, by the British, by the Ayatollah Khomeini. There was an event called the Karbala, which stands for, it's like the calamity, which is where basically the final grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, through his daughter Fatima, was basically surrounded by thousands of troops along with his family. and murdered by the Sunnis. When he came out and he said they cut him off from water, so he came out and he held his son out and he said, at least let the children drink. So they just shot an arrow through the child's neck. It's fascinating. Even if you've got no interest in history or no interest in religion, the actual drama, the theatrics, the story is incredible. I'm tempted to read this book again. You know, if it wants a rating, it gets 10 out of 10. Also, it's very, very clever looked at politically and really pertinent now with the war that's going on in Ukraine, you know. Let me read this section to you here, right? Whatever balance there was would be changed utterly by World War I and the consequent partitioning of the former Ottoman Empire. Western intervention reshaped the Middle East, often in what seemed astonishingly cavalier fashion. The British enabled the Wahhabi Saudi takeover of Arabia, installed a foreign Sunni king over Shia majority in Iraq, and shored up a Nazi sympathizer, Reza Khan, as the Shah of Iran. After World War II, the United States took over as prime mover. Motivated by Cold War ideology, it helped engineer a coup d'etat against Iran's newly elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and reinstated the autocratic regime of Reza Khan's son, Shah Reza Pahlavi, under whom Iran first aspired to nuclear power, with American encouragement. Successive US administrations backed the Wahhabi-dominated Kingdom of Saudi Arabia not only for access to its oil, but also as a bulwark against Nasser's pro-Soviet regime across the Red Sea in Egypt. In the 1980s, the United States joined forces with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan to fund the anti-Soviet Mujahideen, literally jihad fighters, or as Ronald Reagan preferred to call them, freedom fighters, in Afghanistan. And in a rather stunning example of unintended consequence, these troops later formed the basis of the Taliban. In that same decade, the United States found itself arming both sides in the Iran-Iraq war, supporting Saddam Hussein in order to counter the fierce anti-Americanism of post-revolutionary Iran, whilst also supplying Iran in the murky arms for hostages Iran-Contra affair. I mean, that's quite fascinating, and that's probably the most boring part of the book. So it's an incredibly interesting book. It was Wahhabis. So Wahhabis were basically people who, you know, thought they were more pure than anybody else. All right, and so they actually broke away from the Sunnis is the correct pronunciation, who themselves were quite, you know, they had no problem with killing. The first Muslims to kill other Muslims after Muhammad, the Sunnis killed Shias. All right, Shia Ali, who is a leader of the Shia movement, or the bloodline of Muhammad, was completely against it. Anyway, Ali was eventually killed off by a Wahhabi. So, you know, the Wahhabis are about as central to actual Islam as, you know, my fist is to actual planting flowers. Just a brand of violence and extremism. I mean, they established themselves by finding a Muslim they didn't like, taking his pregnant wife, tying her to a tree, disemboweling her, removing the baby from her stomach, killing the baby, then chopping off the head of the man. Just fucked up, violent terrorists, the Wahhabis always seem to have been, still are, in most cases it seems. So I think I've probably said enough now to get myself in lots of trouble for this video. For entertainment, for education, for insight, for learning about religion, history, anything, this book is fantastic. I am going to read it again. So that is After the Prophet, the epic story of the Shia-Sunni split by Lesley Hazleton. Easily gets a 10 out of 10.